And good day, all of you webinar listeners, watchers, the whole thing. I want to welcome you to the webinar, to today's webinar, which is sponsored by the UC Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education. I'm Margaret Heisel, a senior research associate with the center, and certainly welcoming you. You're going to hear speakers that are addressing very important issues. As you know, CSAG identifies strategic issues in higher education and conducts research on those issues and also publicizes high-quality research on the issues. And today is a very important issue. We are hearing from three distinguished speakers on the issue of international higher education, focusing on the relationship of China and US, Chinese and US higher education, from many, many important respects that you're going to learn. Now, our speakers, who I want to introduce, they will speak first and then they will respond to questions that you may have raised upon registration. Our speakers are first, William Lacey, who is Professor Emeritus in Human Ecology at UC Davis and also former Vice Provost of University Outreach and International Programs at UC Davis. He's also a fellow of the American Association of Science, the past president of 3 international professional organizations, very important ones. And he's also author of a great deal of important research in international. Karen Fisher is also going to speak. She is a senior writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education, where she writes about international education. She also publishes a very popular weekly newsletter on global education called Latitudes. And finally, another speaker we will have is Shanshan Zheng Britan, who is a researcher and staff member here at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at UC Berkeley. She came to the United States as a student from China and earned a PhD degree in educational policy studies from the University of Wisconsin. And her research focuses on international and comparative higher education. So now I turn to those speakers. Bill, would you begin for us, please?
Well, thank you, Margaret. I'm very pleased to join Karen and Shanshan to address a number of these important issues. All three of us have had and spent significant time, substantially focused on China-US higher education, collaborations, and some of the challenges of those collaborations, and how important they are for our system. As many of you are aware and have done as well, I've spent most of my career involved in international university collaborations, co-authoring with colleagues from five different continents and conducting USAID research in places like India, Sudan, Brazil. However, in the last quarter of a century, since arriving at UC Davis, I have focused much effort on our Chinese partnerships, our collaborations, facilitating those relationships, and examining and analyzing them as well. Today, we will briefly address several topics that impact those relationships, the competition, the cooperation, in the context of the geopolitical arena. So the next slide, please. These are the topics we'll be addressing. What are the goals and forms of the Chinese-US collaboration? Why do we do these things? What are the benefits? What do we see as the outcomes? What are the forms they take? And we'll take a closer look at that. Any collaboration requires understanding the background and history of our partners. And China's had a particularly challenging and interesting career development of their higher education system, as many of you are well aware. We'll take a look then at the status today that Shanna and I will share with you, Shanshan. And then finally, we'll take a look at the political context, the higher education challenges, and the issues of and considerations for our collaboration and competition. Next slide, please. These are obviously some of the goals, not all of them, but some of the goals: strengthening knowledge generation, dissemination, and application, all primary goals of our universities. Preparing students for a global economy and a global society, critical for the future, actually. I think we shortchange our students if we don't do both. Enhancing the economic and community development is another key goal for these collaborations. Soft diplomacy, increasing the visibility, the reputation, the national rankings, the international rankings, another goal. Providing host university income, both income and resources through such things as tuition and so on. I saw this particularly in Australia when I spent a year there in the mid 2015-16, looking at their higher education system, highly dependent on the tuition revenues. And finally, producing intellectual property and products which are creating a lot of challenges for our institutions, not unlike the challenges we face with university industry partnerships. Okay, next slide, please. Well, what forms then do those take? China and the US higher education collaborations are some of the most extensive and diverse and most creative in a lot of different ways. Starting first with the student exchange, which has often been one of the keys. The undergraduate and graduate education. We now host in the US over 1 million students and have been doing so for the last few years, several years. China has been number one for nearly a quarter of a century, with 1 or 2 years of exception when India became number one. But over the last several years, it's been China as our number one key partner and collaborator for student exchange. Now, 44% of those students come for graduate education, while 35% for undergraduate, and the others for optional instruction. Other interesting figures, because this has been in some ways a one-way street, and I think that's an issue that we need to consider. While China has been number one, the number of students that we send overseas has, and particularly to China, has been quite low. Study abroad is generally a European experience for our students going abroad. 75 to 80% go to Europe for their study abroad. In 2018-19, just before the pandemic, we did have 11,000 of our students going to China, but that's out of a total of 350,000. So a very small percentage. At the same time, China was sending 300,000 to us, 290, 300, 350,000. So it seems to be a real issue if we want our students to better understand the cultures and the history and the goals of our Chinese partners. But they've remained a key. 90% of those students go to doctoral universities in the US, is another interesting thing. But I want to, it's not guaranteed this is going to continue. And I think it reminded me of the history of another university about 50 years ago that was number one in sending students to the US for a decade. And today don't even appear among the top dozen institutions in sending students to the US. And that's Iran. So I just mentioned that in passing. Joint degrees is another key partnership, and those have been particularly creative with our Chinese partners. We're exploring, Davis has a 3+X master's degree program, but there's a Sino-American 1+2+1 that 40 US universities participate in through the American Association of State and College and Universities. Another area is the whole area of scholar exchange. And once again, China is the number one partner. And why is that important? Well, about 80% of those people who are scholars who are coming to the US each year focus on research, on the generation of knowledge. So that partnership and those visiting scholars are critical for the generation of our new science, technology, and innovation. They used to come for 1 to 3 years, and they usually study 78% study in the STEM fields. So quite revealing in terms of how critical that scholar exchange happens to be. And we have over 100,000 scholars that come to us international scholars that come to us each year. But as you can see, China remains, even today, as one of the most important. There was a period where 1/3 of all of the international scholars for about 5 years, between about 2013-14 and 2019, 1/3 were coming from China. Other key forms of that partnership: joint and courtesies and staff and faculty appointments. Another key area, increasingly with China, have been joint conferences and workshops. I can remember about a quarter of a century ago going to my 4th international conference on food science and technology with a key partner in China. And that conference had become one of the leading conferences on food science and technology. Even in 2000, there were 250 to 300 participants. Many of you have your own examples, and I'm only drawing on the Davis examples because that's the one I know best. But we also had an interesting conference with Jiuzhaigou National Park and Sichuan University to look at interesting issues of water and environmental stewardship, the impact of tourism on that beautiful national park. So very creative kinds of conferences and workshops that many of you have organized in your own universities, and we continue to do so in ours. Centers and institutes are another emerging opportunity for collaboration. And we've created one called the China Center for Energy and Transportation between Tsinghua and Tongji, looking at clean energy, clean transportation, and so on, clean vehicles. Another is the Sino-US Food and Ag Innovation Center with not just another university, but another city in China. A recent one is Predict China, which is a U.S. Agency for International Development collaboration, which includes Wuhan Institute of Virology and provincial centers that disseminate information. And what's its agenda? To prevent, detect, and rapidly respond to infectious pathogens that spread from wildlife to humans. So addressing, not only are they just interesting and important centers, but they're addressing some of the key and grand challenges that we're facing. Branch campuses, we don't have one, I think, fortunately in some ways, but they have become quite important. The U.S. universities have probably between 75 and 100 branch campuses around the world. And there are 5 or 6 in China. One of the most famous is the NYU Shanghai campus. There's the Duke Kushan University. There's the Johns Hopkins Nanjing Center and a few others. But another example of collaborations, and these are not just study abroad offices, these are freestanding universities. Perhaps one of the most important areas for the future of research and science is the whole area of co-publishing books, articles, journal articles. I think it's important, once again, to recognize that China is our leading partner. So not only is it our leading partner with our student exchange, our scholar exchange, but in terms of the dissemination of that knowledge after it's been generated, is a key outcome of the collaborations with China. And you may have seen some of the recent data that shows that in 18% of all publications coming out of the scientific community in 2010 were international collaborations. Now it's nearly 1/4 of all those. And the US has co-authors 35% of the world's international co-authored titles. And China, once again, is among the leaders in that. Collaborations on a number in China constitutes 26% of that total. So that collaboration, that co-publishing is really critical. Serving on journal boards and co-editors is another key collaboration that I've been offered and do have served on one of those boards. Exploring joint economic ventures. Historically, our universities have had university industry partnerships with some of those interesting challenges and opportunities. Now we're seeing new joint economic ventures. One of the more interesting ones that didn't survive, but was an interesting one, was the Beijing Genomics Institute that we established. It was the largest company offering genomic sequencing with multiple sequencing of genomes and multiple publications in Science and elsewhere. And they had sites in Shanghai and Hong Kong. We devoted about $8 to $10 million in renovating space, and they moved large amounts of their equipment to do that work to our medical center. But it didn't survive, and I'm not sure all the details of why. But once again, it's an interesting economic venture. And then creating joint academic committees and task forces, another way to build these collaborations. And finally, excuse me, participating in international association. I would mention this is an interesting one, the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, one that I've been active in. It includes 12 universities, leading research universities in China, 3 from Hong Kong, which are part of that now mix. The AAU, the leading research universities on the West Coast, which includes 12 universities in Washington, Oregon, and California. And they have pursued joint workshops, task forces, conferences on food security, climate change, global health, and the river of fire, basically the geophysical issues around earthquakes and so on. So that's why and what we're doing with collaboration. Now let's take a look with our next slide with Chinese higher education. Now, it has obviously gone through a number of dramatic changes in the last 50 or 60 years. And some of us have been part of that whole process. Tensions between the revolutionary ideology and modernization have been consequential for the higher education system in China. And it's important for us to understand some of that as well in partnering with them, because their history is very different than the history of the US in terms of our higher education system. And doesn't have the large number of private universities, for example, as a distinction between just the Chinese higher education system. Today, it's the world's largest higher education system with 3,000 colleges and universities, over 44 million students enrolled, and many of the universities ranked in the top 200. And now, increasingly, a destination for international students. It's the most popular country in Asia and second most in the world. And why is that interesting? Well, 7 out of the 8 leading countries sending students to the US through our international student exchange come from Asia. And so there is a potential source of competition as they become they are the most popular country, and yet we rely heavily on our partnerships with not just China, but with Korea and Japan and Taiwan and Thailand and so on. All important to understand the history and background of higher education in China. Next slide, please. It began, as many of you know, with a Western-style university established in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and those are some of the universities. It became more socialist-oriented through a system that followed the Soviet university model, highly centralized, specialized institutions with research housed in academies of science. And then came some of the tensions with a great leap forward, and college students enrollment went from 962,000 in 1960 to only 534,000 in 66. Next slide, please. The Cultural Revolution perhaps created the greatest challenge to higher education in China. Most of if not all the universities were closed. Millions of people were sent to the rural areas, including most university professors and staff, to the countryside. And that is my alarm and I'm supposed to wrap up. So let's go to the next slide and see what I have there. Leaders played a major role in developing higher education. And these are some of the leaders that played a major role with a focus on science and STEM fields. Next slide, please. And the evolution has been substantial, and with projects that focus primarily on the premier universities, the leading universities. And those are some of the projects: Project 211, 985, double first class, Plan 111, and 863 program. Next slide, please. And now you see a system that's dynamic today, more mass in its orientation, large numbers of vocational education, but still a major discrimination between urban and rural access, with rural populations, college-age students not getting much access. Next slide, please. And finally, my last slide. We can come back to some of the others, but my last slide is this one. The research and publications have been dramatic and increased in part because of the heavy investment in research and development expenditures. Second, passing your EU, and the publications have also matched that investment in research. And China has overtaken the US a number one ranked country or territory for contributions to research articles published in the Nature Index group. Okay, and I would argue they are now clearly the top collaborator. So now I'll turn the next presentation over to my colleague, Shasha.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. Now I will kind of shift gear to talk about student mobility between China and the US. Bill has talked a little bit about it, but here's some basic stats about how many students are coming to the US from China. Last year, there were over 700,000 Chinese students studying abroad, and 41 of them came to the United States. So US is apparently a major destination for Chinese students. Among these students, a third of them major in STEM fields, and half of them study at graduate level. If we look at US itself, 27% of international students come from China. This is the latest stats. Before, it was actually a higher percentage, so about 34% are actually from China. And if you like the international scholars, postdocs, China also provides a substantial amount of them coming to the US. So just a brief history of China-US student mobility. The earliest Chinese international student could be traced back to 1850s, who graduated from Yale University in classic studies. And at the early 20th century, there were Boxer indemnity scholars came to the United States. These were the scholars funded by the Chinese government. President Theodore Roosevelt signed a treaty with China, kind of returned some of the money that signed on the Boxer Indemnity Treaty to help Chinese government fund its scholars to study in the US. However, later, the study abroad activities waned a lot because China was going through the Second World War and also the Civil War, and the first 3 decades of the establishment of PRC. There was a lot of political turmoil, economic poverty, and also just the Western animosity against communism has all combined to really dampen the study abroad activities. It was not until late 1970s when we saw increasing numbers of students who came to the US or study abroad in general. And starting 2000s, we're now seeing the acceleration of the studying abroad from China to the US. And that has a lot to do with the emerging new middle class in China, with economic development, and also this new desire for families to get Western credential for their only child. And so, to use the sociologist Yi Ma's word, studying abroad has become a new urban gospel in China. So here's a graph that shows the trend of Chinese international students in America. You could probably see at around 2008, 2009, there was a turning point when the international student increased a lot, and that's when the financial recession hit. A lot of American universities were struggling with the revenue, and so bringing more international students became an important source of revenue. And the trend continued, and of course, the pandemic has had a big impact on student mobility. But what this graph doesn't show is that actually the number rebounded after 2021. But if you look closely at the level of study, graduate students used to be the main population coming to the US. Starting 2013 or 14, we saw more undergraduate students coming to study in the US. So why do these students come to the US? Well, there are a lot of reasons. One of them is just to avoid the competitive Gaokao system in China, which was the college entrance exam. In 2012, only 30% of high school graduates could go to college, and less than 5% could go to the elite few. That's like the 958, right, 211 programs. But recent years, there has been some changes because there has been a smaller high school graduate cohorts. So the percentage going college going percentage is higher than before. Another reason why student wants to come to the US is the prestige of the US universities, particularly the global rankings of US universities. And also this more general trend of commodification of higher education, not just the US, but also in a lot of other countries where higher education has kind of been transformed from being a public good to a private consumption, right? So we see this neoliberal trend of commodifying education, where families and students are shouldering the financial responsibilities of the college education. And so through my own research, I looked at the college experience of Chinese students in US campus, and particularly it's interesting to look at how the increase of this international students also happened at the time when the US universities are pushing for more diversity and inclusion on campus. So for a lot of universities in the US, Chinese students actually bring both cash and diversity. And as a result, a lot of times the students were kind of objectified as cash cows. I've heard colleagues who work in the international office are saying that, the university leadership came to them and said, oh, this year we were short on our budget, so let's find more Chinese students. So that's not uncommon. And another thing is that a lot of times the Chinese students are kind of racialized in the US as well, particularly since 2016. And there are various forms of racialization, right? So there's culture-based exclusion, where these students are just framed in negative deficit language, that these students are passive, unwilling to participate, they're uncritical. But since the pandemic, we've seen more overt racism against Chinese nationals. But at the same time, I want to also draw our attention to the fact that Chinese international students are not just powerless victims, right? They also bring them assumption and understanding of race when they came to the US. So that has a lot to do with how, for example, whiteness and blackness are portrayed in Chinese state media and the economic policies. So during the 1980s, the Chinese economic reforms, there's a lot of narratives around how industrialized nations in Europe, North America were associated with civilization, associated with economic prosperity, whereas you see African countries, Latin American countries are also always associated with poverty. And so that has a big impact on what Chinese students think of race, even though race is not explicitly mentioned in those narratives. So in some ways, these students are also kind of participating in a global racial hierarchy while studying in the US. And of course, political identities is an important dimension of studying student mobility. One thing that's important to know is that studying abroad or international education is part of China's nation building in the 21st century, right? Because current Chinese students who are in the US are not only expected to garner human capital, right, the Western credentials, but also to remain patriotic to their homeland, right? That can help China to become a global leader in politics and as well as economy. And there are structures that set up to help facilitate that. And one of the structures is the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, or CSSA. These are affiliated with the Chinese consulates in the US, and almost at each major university in the US, there's a chapter of CSSA. And these organizations, they have a lot of programs. A lot of them are cultural programs, like Celebrate Spring Festival, et cetera. But they also have lectures with the consuls where they kind of keep the students connected with what's going on in China, and also just trying to make sure that they can remain patriotic while being in the United States. And I won't go into details about each institutions, but their institutional culture also played a role in shaping the political identities of Chinese students. And of course, the majors, where usually social science major students are more engaged in conversation about politics, or US, China politics, compared to STEM students. And one important narrative that I think was circulating right now is this idea of Chinese dream, which was coined by President Xi Jinping in 2012. It was framed on purpose to counter the American dream, the narrative. While the American dream is the dream to individual success, the Chinese dream is the dream to national success. So overseas Chinese students are a crucial part of this Chinese dream, right? Because they are part of this idea, the National Rejuvenation Plan. And at the same time, there are also Chinese government is also trying to not just send more students to study abroad, but also to attract more international students. Like Bill mentioned briefly, they wanted to attract, for example, there's goals set to attract a certain number of students from the US. And there are over 11,000 UNIS students in China in 2018-19, but actually in 2012 and 21, we saw a big decline. There was only 211 students from the US in China, and there's a lot of reasons that could explain that decline. And of course, right now, China, the most international students in China are from Africa and Asia. That's kind of echoing the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the biggest global project that China is engaging with. And just really quickly about more current how the most recent challenges that China is facing. There's economic slowdown, rising unemployment rate, and the increasing political surveillance over citizens, universities, and businesses have created more uncertainties about student mobility, right, from other countries to China. And now I will turn to Karen to talk about challenges in Chinese higher education.
Thanks, Shanshan. Yes, I mean, as both Bill and Shanshan have suggested, I think it's fair to say that higher education has long been an important part of Chinese development. And it's also the Sino-American partnerships in higher education. Those academic partnerships have also over time been quite critical. But I would suggest that we're in a new moment now where these issues, higher education, is becoming even more central, both to how China sees itself and to its relationship with the United States. Just after Xi Jinping came to power more than a decade ago, he gave a speech to the Politburo, and he called education a strategic precursor to building a modern China. And he said universities must aim at the frontiers of the world's science and technology and major national needs. And so I think when we look at particularly the relationship between China and the US, the academic relationship, I think we can talk about both tensions and opportunities, and also missed opportunities. Take as Shanshan said, the issue of Chinese international students in the US. It is probably, for most Americans, the most visible form of Chinese-American academic partnership. As Shanshan noted, these numbers were incredibly high at one point, and it was a disproportionate number of Chinese students who came to the US. And so in some ways, you think that's an incredible opportunity, because you have just the two most, biggest world superpowers, and their future leaders are often in classrooms and dorms with one another. But was that an opportunity that was ever realized? And as Shan noted, those numbers have declined, although the number of Chinese students did increase last year. India now has overtaken China as the largest center of international students to the US. And if the idea between exchange is to build this mutual understanding between two people, you have to ask, what was the impact of that? A 2021 survey by Pew asked Americans about whether they favored limits on Chinese students studying in the US. And let's just say, let me point out that international students have long been broadly supported within the US public. But in this survey, more than half, in fact, 55% of Americans said they favored limits specifically on Chinese students, and 1 in 5 favored them strongly. So we're in a different climate, I would say, both here in the US and in China. Next slide, please. So I think particularly in the national context, academic freedom is a terrifically important one. Again, this is nothing new. There's always been a tension in China where you see both, as Bill pointed out, Chinese leaders using research and innovation and knowledge building within universities is a critical way to spur economic and the country's development. Yet universities, as they are in the US, have always also been sort of the places of dissent. And so there's always been this tension between how much do you kind of cultivate and give universities the space to flourish, and how much from a governmental view in China do you want to control them? And I would say we have definitely swung in the last 10 years under Xi. The pendulum has swung to more control. The university, the government has said, for example, it will evaluate universities on so-called ideological index, and it has imposed greater Communist Party control on universities. There's more, they're now explicitly supposed to have, Communist Party leaders explicitly supposed to have more comprehensive leadership over teaching, research, and administration. And in fact, they're mandating sort of a quota, minimum number of party members who have to be among the faculty. And although this is more recent, it was very much from the outset of Xi coming into office that he really focused on this. Back in 2013, there was a document that's leaked out and spread to the Communist Party groups and to the universities. It was called Document 9, and it listed a number of topics that were pretty much off limits. And of course, there had always been these topics that were off limits, these taboo topics. We called them the 3 Ts: Taiwan, Tiananmen, and Tibet. But this expanded these topics and included things like civil society, constitutionalism, economic neoliberalism, press freedom, anything that questioned the validity of the Chinese economic reforms, and anything that talked about the historic mistakes of the Chinese party. And so many people saw this as sort of Xi setting sort of the ground rules and saying, look, we are going to be much more aggressively interested in regulating academic freedom. And, I think, you can also see if that's what's off limits. What are Chinese universities supposed to be talking about? Well, there is a push to have what's called Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And so you had all these centers on campus flourishing to talk about Xi Jinping's ideology for China as Shan said, that the Chinese dream, essentially. And you had this expansion, which has always been there, but of a patriotic education that starts in the younger schools but now is firmly in the universities as well. And so it's created an environment on campus where there's just simply less freedom to talk. There has been longstanding concerns about informants on Chinese campuses, of students and reporting on their fellow students and on their teachers. But there's actually also been concerns that there's even cameras in classrooms. And when those have been publicly discussed, the university leaders always say, well, this is to ensure teaching quality and to make sure that nobody's cheating. But the fact is, people do feel like they're being watched. And this comes into the international environment in a number of ways. Bill pointed out the high number of joint publications, but there have been between Chinese scholars and scholars overseas, but there have been a number of instances in which Chinese government has sought to censor international academic journals, trying to take out from their database, either restrict access to databases or take out certain kinds of research that they, for one reason or another, find problematic. And in at least a couple of cases, some major publishers have acquiesced and gone along with that. And while patriotic education has focused within the Chinese system, it has also been increasingly focused on those students who are elsewhere. And so we have a number of instances in which Chinese students who are on American campuses have dealt with the sense that their academic freedom in the American context was being constrained. And so you have a student at the University of Minnesota who was arrested for and jailed for some social media posts he made while a student in the US that were critical of the Chinese government. You had a showdown at George Washington University where one group of Chinese students took down all these posters put up by another group of Chinese students who were critical of Xi's leadership. And a Berkeley student at the Berkeley College of Music was recently convicted of threatening a fellow Chinese student who was an activist. And he was threatened to chop her bastard hands off and sick the security forces on her family at home. And so Freedom House and among other groups supporting academic freedom say U.S. colleges actually have to do more to protect vulnerable students from transnational repression. They need to have maybe offices explicitly to help international students who might be dealing with these kinds of pressures, and have policies that address them. And I would also say the environment has affected foreign scholars coming into China now. I mean, it's very difficult to decouple this from COVID and just the ways that it was difficult to travel. But there are concerns that a number of topics that once were easily, comfortably subject to inquiry by visiting foreign researchers are now off limits and have become politicized. And so it's making, I think, people more conscious and cautious about going to China. Next slide. I'm not going to get into this very much. Shanshan already mentioned that just a very, very small percentage of Chinese students have any access to the most elite universities. But I would also say there's also been a sort of questioning, as there is here in the US, about the value of education in China, because particularly college graduates among all the population have been subject to very high unemployment rates. About 1 in 5 recent graduates are unemployed. And so I think there are some questions internally about China, about whether or not the university reforms in the past have been correct, whether they've been focused on the right thing, whether ones that were focused very much on raising up elite research universities were the right thing, or if China needs to invest more in science and technology, but at the vocational level. Next slide. So there's been a huge growth in scientific publications from Chinese researchers that has led to some concerns about quality of those publications, and indeed the Chinese government itself has expressed that concern and has been encouraging universities to more closely look at the quality of the research publications. And so on one hand, there is this sense that, and this is particularly because there are metrics that Chinese faculty are measured on that emphasize getting published in international journals. Is that an incentive to publish more and not necessarily of quality? But at the same time, I think there are a number of different analyses now that have put China at par with or ahead of the US in some of the most highly cited papers. For example, Caroline Wagner at Ohio State did some work with a number of colleagues in China and the Netherlands. And when they looked through the site, through the Web of Science, they found that beginning in 2019, China overtook the US in the share of the top 1% of cited publications. Next slide. So I think, this suggests this was for a long time quite a problem for China. And it is still the case, to be honest, that about 90% of Chinese doctoral students who earn their degrees in the US stay here. And that's third behind Iran and India. But I also think that there have been efforts to reverse this, where China has sought to lure back through so-called talent programs more researchers. And I also think that there is a push factor as well. There have been a number of efforts, both at the national level and the states, that have focused on academic ties with China and have sought to scrutinize them and to push them to be more regulated. And so, it is, as Bill suggested, there was a point, a decade ago or 2 decades ago when scholars and researchers with ties to China were very much encouraged to expand those institutional partnerships and know these are the kinds of things that are coming under scrutiny. The most prominent example, obviously, is the China Initiative, which is the Trump era investigation under the Justice Department into Chinese ties. But there have been other efforts as well. Most recently in Florida, there is a law that was passed that basically hamstrings Florida public universities from hiring as graduate assistants students from China and about 6 other countries, but China is the main one. And Florida universities are quite worried about this because obviously if you can't offer a graduate student an assistantship, then your ability to attract talented students is really threatened. And, I think there have been a number of surveys that have found that, large numbers of Chinese faculty today feel unwelcome in the US, and that young faculty or young scholars are reconsidering whether to stay. Next slide. Oh, we can skip this one. And I think we have to acknowledge that, there is real concern about Chinese interest in intellectual property. The Chinese government has heavily focused on it. A recent report from a lead scientific policy advisory board to the US government just last week acknowledged that China does not necessarily hew to international norms when it comes to intellectual property. And there have been a handful of scholars and researchers who have been arrested or charged, including one from UC Davis, who either of stealing research or of hiding military ties. Next slide. That said, I think we've got to acknowledge that the China Initiative, before it was canceled, had resulted in relatively few actual convictions. And I think that one of the concerns is that where is the balance going to be found? Next slide. Oh, next slide. And so I would just say, I think one of the things we're looking at is what is that right balance? An ACE survey of colleges found that American colleges still say that China is their most important partner. And research by a University of Arizona professors found that the number of US publications would have actually declined between 2015 and 2020 without having Chinese co-authorship. So those relationships are very important. But I think we have it's going to be a balance about what they look like. Next slide. Next slide. And so I think there's a lot of discussion about how to facilitate and how to strengthen research security while maintaining openness and academic collaboration. I think that there is much more awareness of this on the university level now than there was once. And you certainly see a number of universities working, particularly with scientific agencies, federal science agencies, trying to be proactive and trying to set those rules. But is concern, I think, that they might, that there are other folks who might go overboard and, you'd throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. You'd risk jeopardizing the importance of academic collaboration internationally. And so I think that there are real talks to be had about what happens in the future. Will we stop talking about sort of a binary, a black and white of classified versus open research, and be more nuanced in what we can share? On one hand, I think there's some reasons to be optimistic. I think that there's active conversation, particularly among colleges, about how to strike this balance. And as Shanshan mentioned, in terms of academic exchange, from the Chinese side, you have seen in the last few months, Xi Jinping and others very much say that they would like to welcome Americans back to China. But I have to offer to close with a caveat that this is March 2024, and we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if he's going to be elected in November. And while certainly the track record that President Trump had on Sino-American higher education relationships and on Chinese students was certainly more stark than his successor, President Biden. I think that there's a lot of concern that this sort of get on tough rhetoric that is bipartisan in Washington could spread and could also continue to affect the nature of these higher education partnerships. So with that, let me turn it back over to Margaret.
Hello. Thank you very much, all of you. May I raise a question registered at registration? Here's one, and I think this relates to you directly, Karen. Would all international students from China now go to the UK, Canada, and Australia as a result of China-US tension? Does the US lose more in this geopolitical situation?
Yes and no. Certainly, when you look at those numbers, as Shanshan illustrated, you have seen, you saw an incredible rise and then fall. And as she noted, there's a number of complicating factors that have caused that decline. And some of it is stuff like the pandemic, which is past, and some of it is more internal questions, concerns about ROI for an American degree, but politics does play a role. And certainly a number of students have shared that they feel sort of pressure, political pressure, being in the US. The US-China Education Trust did a survey of Chinese alumni of American colleges, and among the youngest alumni, those who've graduated in the last decade, they were much more likely to say that they felt political pressure, and that's about a third of them, and then graduates who had come and studied in the US in previous generations. And it's hard to tell really if they mean they're feeling the political pressure from their fellow Chinese students or the Chinese government, or if they're feeling very much singled out because they are Chinese in the American context. And a very high number of them said that of the most recent graduates said that they felt discriminated against. So in some sense, yes, we certainly should be worried about that. However, these other countries that we've named also have their own tensions with China, which have also affected the education relationships. And so I don't think it's as cut and dry as suggesting that students are going to just all decamp from the US and go elsewhere.
Yes, I think despite the climate, I would agree with Karen, despite the climate, 290,000 Chinese students have come here this year. So India and China are about equivalent, depending on the statistics you look at. Some say they're about tied. Some say China's still slightly ahead. But it's still a large number, and the conditions affecting attendance are certainly include the geopolitical climate, but it includes those other factors as well.
I just wanted to add that yes, I agree with Karen and Bill. Like geopolitics does play a big role. But as Bill noted, that we still have a lot of Chinese students still coming to the U.S. right recently, and when I was talking with Chinese students here, and they would say that the geopolitical tension, they are aware of it, but I think they can prioritize the goal of getting a degree that could lead them to better jobs in the future, whether it's in the US or elsewhere or in China. That the tensions of geopolitical may affect their plans to stay in the US in the future or not. But in terms of getting an education degree, as long as US universities have the best rankings in the world, they will continue to attract Chinese students.
Okay. Another question, and I think an important one. I believe, Bill, you probably have best knowledge on this. I'm particularly one of the questions raised upon registration says, I am particularly interested in the role Chinese American scholars play in partnerships between the US and Chinese. Could you?
Well, I think the data that I was suggesting shows how critical and how important that partnership has been, not just through the education of graduate students, but also through the postdoc and scholars, visiting scholars, 80% of which come to study and do research, not to study, but do research for 1 to 3 years. And then the co-publication rates really suggest that partnership is vibrant, it's strong, and it's important for U.S. science.
Thank you. Karen or Shanshan, do you want to add anything?
No, that was great.
Okay. What are some effective examples and practices of institutional advocacy to address and tackle the impact of global conflicts on international students? Whoever has some responses on that, please go ahead.
This is not so much an example, but to say that I think this has increasingly become a preoccupation of people who work with international students.
What are their strategies?
Yes, and so the problem is that they are somewhat limited in those strategies. They can, for example, say things like, emphasize that they are supportive of the presence of international students and of Chinese international students on their campuses, and that they are welcome there. And they can certainly work with them to work with their students on, making sure that they can, access postgraduate work, for example, and give them that kind of practical support. But unfortunately, a lot of it, aside from advocating for the different kinds of legislation, for example, for a national strategy in recruiting international students, I think colleges have been a lot playing defense. They've had to do very active things rather than because they can't shape geopolitics.
Yes.
In some ways, the diversity, inclusion, equity and inclusion programs on our campuses are trying to respond not just to the bias and prejudice against Asians or Chinese students, but broadly how we build a community that respects each other, regardless of race and creed and color and ideology. And those programs are under fire, to be honest with you. It's it's that they are being attacked by state legislatures around the country. So it's an interesting challenge. They're coming up with some strategies, but they're also under the gun.
Thank you. Thank you. Here's another question, a final one. What role does gender play? Are there more female students coming from China, and in which fields? which academic fields?
I would just simply say that in STEM fields, there are more male students. But in general, I don't think there's a big difference between male and female students coming from China in the numbers.
Yeah, China certainly looks much more equitable than a number of other large sending countries to the US, like India or Pakistan.
Or other Middle Eastern countries as well. Exactly.
All right, all three of you. I am saying thank you so much. We have reached 1 p.m. and I have learned so much from you. Thank you so much.